I wanted to talk you through the latest later life borrowing report that More to Life has just released in the last few weeks. And this is based on research that we've commissioned through the Centre for Economics and Business Research, or CEBR. In fact, it's now in its 5th edition. We've been publishing this research on a regular basis over the last few years, and all of the previous research, including the new research, is available on our website. I will give you a pointer and a steer to that or a little bit later on towards the end of the presentation. But what that collection of research really gives now is a fascinating insight into the data, into the trends and the market drivers behind borrowing in later life. And it's the research really that we've just published in the last few weeks that I wanted to just talk you through some of the headlines in this presentation today over the next 10 minutes or so. And what that shows, or one of the key aspects coming out of that research, is that debt amongst older borrowers has been increasing regularly and rapidly over the last few years, particularly amongst the slightly younger age group. Debt amongst the 55 to 64-year-old age group has been growing at a much sharper rate than older borrowers. And indeed, amongst that particular age group, it's mortgage debt that is on the rise. In fact, since the last time we did this research in 2020, that average debt has increased from around 90,000 of mortgage debt to just over £106,000 of debt. And those holding unsecured debt will hold on average around £8,800. So it's clear to see that although there has been some consolidation of debt, particularly in the early months of the COVID pandemic, the fallout from the pandemic is continuing to eat away and bite at the finances of those entering or just beginning their retirement journeys. And we expect that to continue for some years to come. Taking debt as a whole, according to the Bank of England, as at June this year, we owed something approaching £1.7 trillion of debt, 1,742 billion as at June 2021. Looking at the over-55s specifically, they now owe something in the region of £236 billion of that debt. And in fact, that's slightly up on last year's, the amount that was owed in last year's survey, or the results we saw in last year's survey, up by about £10 billion. So again, although there's been some consolidation of debt as people tightened belts in the early months of the pandemic, debt and borrowing has actually seen a slight increase on last year. And we do expect that to continue. In fact, another headline that came out of this year's research is that 1 in 4 of those aged 55 and above say that their financial position has actually worsened since March 2020, the onset of the COVID pandemic. So although we've seen some tightening of belts, debt levels continuing to rise, those aged over 55 continuing to say, or at least a proportion of them, that their financial situation has actually worsened as a result of the pandemic. And we don't expect that to necessarily be gone once the virus is gone, or certainly dissipated. We expect the shock waves of that to continue to eat into finances of over 55s for some years to come. And indeed, what we can see as the research projects forward from where we are, forward to 2031, which is where this graph ends, we can see a sharp incline in the total debt owed by those over the age of 55. In fact, by the time we get to 2031, that debt will have climbed to something around £322 billion, which is again an increase on the forecast that we were making this time last year of around £22 billion. So it's clear that debt is on the rise. More and more of those of pensionable age are likely to find themselves in debt as they transit through their retirement years. Now, if we look at unsecured debt specifically, what the research found is that this is split into a number of different pots, if you like. By far the biggest, but not the most common, are things like car finance. Around about sort of £9,500 is typically owed by those over the age of 55. Actually, the most common form of debt amongst the older borrower is credit cards, with a typical average balance of around £3,000. And after that, we find other unsecured personal loans, so non-mortgage debt, are around £6,500. But the most common being credit cards. And just looking at Key's data for a moment, Key produce a regular market monitor and a full year report each year. What we can see is from 2020 that of the typical average release from an equity release client of around about £85,000, almost half of that is typically used to repay some form of debt, either unsecured or secured. So whilst we can see that debt is continuing to play an important role in the over 55s market, although some people have started to repay debt as COVID has bitten, I suspect that we'll see equity release continue to play a really important role in the repayment of debt in older borrowers. And we expect to see unsecured debt continuing to rise. So the research that we've just conducted through CBR predicts that by the end of next year, unsecured debt amongst the over 55s will total something around £19 billion, but by 2031 that will almost double to around about £38 billion. So equity release, as it does now, is likely to continue to play an important part of helping customers mitigate some of that more expensive debt, particularly, of course, credit card debt. Really, the future of that rise in unsecured debt is perhaps explained most tellingly by this statistic coming from our research, that 1 in 3 of those over 55s that were researched said that they were accruing debt specifically to meet everyday living costs. This isn't to enjoy a cruise around the world or a new car. This is purely to meet food costs, pay utility bills, keep the heating on, keep the lighting on. And with credit cards forming the most common type of debt held amongst the over 55s, if you bear in mind the kind of interest rates that are typically applied to those debts, what is also more worrying still is that around 20%, 1 in 5 people, said that they were not repaying that full debt each month. So that £3,000 that people are typically holding on credit cards was not being repaid in full, so likely to be accruing and compounding each month as they add their everyday living expenses to that credit card bill. All of that is backed up really by additional research outside of the borrowing reports that More to Life has conducted with advisors themselves, where we found that 78% of advisors think that more and more customers now will rely on equity release to meet their basic retirement needs. So again, this is not about splashing out, enjoying a fantastically luxurious retirement. It's just about meeting basic retirement needs. And this really lends itself then to another important issue that came out in this year's research, and something that was mirrored from last year's research also, which is around the gender pension gap. So women in particular are suffering as a result not only of underfunding of pensions, but also the additional impacts that COVID and debt in retirement have brought with them. So if we look at some of those statistics in a bit more detail, what we find is that women typically contribute more as a percentage of income than their male counterparts, but expect to receive less. In fact, of the people that were researched as part of the borrowing and retirement report, men typically expected to receive a retirement income of almost £21,000, whereas women were expecting an income significantly less than that, just under £15,000, despite the fact they were contributing more as a percentage of their income. And when you take average life expectancy into account, what that means is that women can expect to receive almost £184,000 less over the course of their retirement than men. That's a significant gender pay gap, and one of the reasons why we do see perhaps an overbalance of women or single women, or either divorced or widowed women, taking out equity release because they end up relying on housing equity to plug a gap that has been left by their pension income. And what that means is that women will have to work much longer to plug that gap. Again, taking typical average life expectancy into account, a man working for 40 years, by comparison, a woman will have to work an additional 14 and a half years. In other words, they'll have to work for 54.5 years in order to earn the same amount of retirement income. It's a significant pension gap, and another reason why more and more women, perhaps in later life, as women tend to outlive men, may end up having to rely on housing wealth to plug some of that gap. Now, by 2031, over the course of the next decade, more and more people will be getting older, of course. We'll see not only 1 in 3 people in the UK aged over the age of 55, but around about 13% of our population will be of pensionable age. And there are a number of additional issues that will drive borrowing in later life. We will continue to see issues caused by inadequate state pension, inadequate pension funding generally, as we've just described. There is also continuing uncertainty around how people will pay for social care. Now, we've seen the government make some really rather welcome announcements in the last few weeks, but the devil is in the detail. We know that there is going to be a reform of health and social care. We know that there are proposals for a health and social care levy. And I would encourage you to listen in and tune into Jacqueline Berry's presentation that will touch on more detail around that. But regardless of what the government does, regardless of what plans are brought in, there is going to be continuing uncertainty over exactly how people will fund all of the social care that they require. And there is the ongoing pandemic impact on people's finances. The COVID virus may disappear or dissipate and become less of an issue, but the financial tremors and earthquake that has caused are likely to be felt for a number of years to come, particularly amongst the sandwich generation, those older clients who are perhaps caring for elderly parents at the same time as still looking after grown-up children who continue to live at home. The bank of mum and dad, the bank of gran and granddad has never been under greater strain perhaps than it is right now. So we expect that this will drive further growth, particularly in the equity release market. Now, the equity release market over the last couple of years has been stalled somewhat, particularly by COVID over the last 12 months. Again, this year is looking likely it's going to be around about the 4 billion mark, there or thereabouts, around about 3.7, 3.8 perhaps of new lending. Once you add further advances and draw down into that, we might nudge over 4 billion or so. But by 2031, we predict, based on the research through CEBR, that we're looking at a market in excess of £6 billion, perhaps more. And that will be driven, again, largely by those that are looking to mitigate the debt that they are amassing through credit cards, personal loans, car finance, and, of course, existing mortgage debt. So there is plenty of evidence to suggest that the equity release market will continue to see substantial growth in the years to come. And again, looking at what advisors are thinking, they are feeling very confident about the outlook of this market. Compared even to the residential mortgage market, advisors are even more confident that the equity release market will grow over the next 12 months. But subject to, as advisors have told us, lenders, manufacturers continuing to innovate in this space. In fact, more than half of advisors we surveyed consider market innovation as being crucial to the business development and their own business development over the next 12 months. And again, you should tune into Tony Crane's presentation as he will explore some of these issues and the barriers and pathways to future innovation in this market. So that brings me to the end of my presentation. If you want to download our latest Borrowing in Later Life report, you can do so by going to the Learning Lab area of our website, and you'll find links to all of the previous reports on there as well. I do encourage you to download that. It's a fascinating insight into this subject with lots of great data in there, as I said, all commissioned through CBR. So thank you for listening. Hope that was useful and hopefully sets a good foundation for the other guest speakers we have later on today, followed very quickly by the other Stuart Wilson of the equity release market. If there are any further questions that crop into your head, I'll be around today down on the stand as well, so do come along and see us. But thank you very much. Subscribe to our YouTube channel by clicking the link below to ensure that you don't miss out on the latest content, updates and mission briefings from More to Life, the later life lender.